Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Great to have you on the show.
Good to be here. Good to be off a good weekend for myself. Hopefully you had a good weekend too, and hopefully everyone at home did as well.
It's such a nice way to start a show on a Monday. My weekend was fine. I hope everyone's weekend was... I never do that. I too care about your weekends. I just never think to say it. A moral flaw on my part. Also, MP Adnan Hussain has left your party, citing persistent infighting. It's also a way in to discuss a broader topic of the place for social conservatism in left-wing movements. As I'm sure you would have guessed, the majority of the show is going to be talking about Shabana Mahmood's new immigration policies and whether or not the UK should be taking lessons from Denmark. I speak to an academic in Denmark who writes on these issues. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat. Labour came to power promising to stop the boats crossing the English Channel. And despite adopting increasingly harsh rhetoric on immigration, Starmer's government has so far failed to fulfil that promise. 38,000 people have crossed the Channel on small boats this calendar year, which is the second highest number on record. Not unrelatedly, Labour are also way behind reform in the opinion polls. And it's in that context that Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood this weekend announced Britain's asylum policy was about to get much tougher.
I know we have to go further because people are still getting in boats every day, crossing the Channel, putting their lives at risk and those of other people as well. I want to break that business model and I need to show that we can reduce those pull factors that persuade people that they should try to come to this country. That's what the new suite of proposals, the most sweeping set of reforms in modern times, that's what that is designed to do. Because I know illegal migration is causing huge divides here in our own country. And I do believe we need to act if we are to retain public consent for having an asylum system at all.
Shabana Mahmood is currently in Parliament at the moment announcing what she's described as the biggest shake-up in British asylum policy since the Second World War. And we've got some of the headline pitches from the government's white paper published today, sort of summarised by our team. A refugee status will become temporary rather than permanent. So that's sort of the big announcement. Currently, it's the case that once an asylum seeker is granted refugee status, that status is permanent, and they can then apply for indefinite leave to remain after 5 years. Under the new plans, refugees would have to reapply for the status every 2.5 years. And if their home country is deemed to have become safe in the interim, they could then be returned. Another big issue, or another big change, is the road to settled status. So currently, refugees can apply for indefinite leave to remain after 5 years in the UK. Under new plans, that will be extended to 20 years for refugees who arrive through irregular routes. Those who arrive through regular routes will have access to education and employment schemes that will reduce that time depending on stable employment, national insurance contributions and fluency in English. So I suppose more criteria, and especially if you come here irregularly, it's going to be very difficult. Also announced is that human rights protections will be curbed. So judges will be told to interpret the European Convention on Human Rights right to a family life more strictly, with only spouses, parents and children counted as family. The ECHR's right to protection from torture and degrading treatment will also be interpreted in a way that allows the deportation of criminals. Asylum seekers denied asylum will also be allowed only a single appeal instead of multiple appeals. There will be some new legal routes introduced. So you could see this as a quid pro quo. A small number of new safe and legal routes will be introduced, though numbers will be capped, that involve various sponsorship schemes, including by individuals, and may favour students and skilled workers. And then there will be the removal of automatic benefits and the seizure of valuables, which I think is the most gruesome, really, of these announcements. Asylum seekers will only receive, or will no longer receive public funds if they have a right to work or have broken the law. Those who possess high-value items could also have them seized to contribute to the cost of their housing. This final one, I think, is the one that seems sort of most cruel and seems to be more about messaging. The number of people, if you're wondering what asylum seekers have the right to work, that's people who potentially came here on visas and then applied for asylum after that period. So they're not banned from working in the same way that someone would be if they arrived irregularly. Those people will now have to pay their own way. It's pretty clear that Mahmood's tough line on asylum seekers is partly a response to Reform UK. That's a party that's attracting masses of voters, largely on its promises about migration. But by competing with Reform, are Labour just becoming them? Shabana Mahmood doesn't think so.
How do you respond to people who say that you're being panicked into a racist immigration policy?
I reject that entirely. I am the child of immigrants. My parents came to this country legally in the late 60s and the early 70s. This is a moral mission for me. I can see that illegal migration is creating division across our country. I can see that it is polarising communities across the country. I can see that it is dividing people and making them estranged from one another. I don't want to stand back and watch that happen in my country. What is happening with our illegal migration system is this is a broken system. It's not right-wing talking points or fake news or misinformation that is suggesting that we've got a problem. I know, because I have now seen this system inside out, it is a broken system. We have a genuine problem to fix. People are angry about something that is real. It is my job, therefore, to think of a proper solution to this very real problem, to do so in line with my values as a Labour politician, but also as a British citizen, and to have solutions that work so that I can unite a divided country.
It's interesting the way she's saying, because she doesn't want to say, I'm just doing this because I'm scared of Reform. She has to say, I'm doing this because I think it's right. So I think that's what she was really trying to get across there. We'll be discussing all show whether or not there is a moral basis to these claims. I think, especially when it comes to the jewellery, there's none whatsoever. But let's talk about where this is all coming from, because Mahmood's new policies are largely based on the approach of the Danish Social Democrats. Like the Labour Party here, the Danish Social Democrats face the threat of a growing populist right. The populist right in Denmark was led by the Danish People's Party, whose sort of the height of their popularity came in 2015 when they won 20% of the vote. They came second, but they formed a right-wing coalition government. In response, and under the new leadership of Mette Frederiksen, the Social Democrats then shifted dramatically to the right on immigration, pledging to ramp up deterrence policies, which were far higher than its European neighbours, so putting them out of step with their neighbours at that point in time. Electorally, that policy was very successful. The Danish Social Democrats re-entered government in 2019 and have been there ever since. Meanwhile, asylum applications have fallen to 40-year lows, and support for the far-right parties has cratered. The Danish Social Democrats achieved this with many of the policies that Mahmood is now seeking to emulate. So like Mahmood seems to be suggesting, jewellery was confiscated from arriving refugees, although again, I don't think this happened very often. And refugee status became temporary, with tough employment and language requirements added for a refugee to be granted permanent settlement, which could only be applied for after 8 years, so lengthening that. Denmark also introduced one policy Mahmood isn't seeking to adopt. So this was ostensibly designed to improve integration, and it was Denmark's ghetto law, which allowed it to sell, release, or even demolish social housing in neighbourhoods where immigrants make up more than 50% of the inhabitants, forcing them to disperse. So literally people's flats got knocked down. The law came up on Sky's interview with Shabana Mahmood.
The Danes have a very hardline approach on this. They restrict asylum seekers' access to public housing in named areas where there are more than 30% of ethnic minorities, low levels of education, low incomes. And right now, they've got 63 such named areas. And they say that's actually critical to reducing the demand. Why aren't you talking about that approach?
Well, look, firstly, we're not going to be starting to dictate where people live based on percentages. That's not the sort of country that we are. And I don't think that ultimately in a country like ours, which is a very successful, generally speaking, very tolerant, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy, I don't think the test of integration here is whether you have a mix of coloured faces on a particular street or in a particular
You're making the case for the Danish system. I'm just telling you that there's an arm of the Danish system which is essential, and you're not adopting that.
No, I'm telling you that that's not something that I think translates into our country, and that's not something that we are going to be pursuing. But I also don't think that that's the sort of thing that we need in order to make our immigration system work in this country.
So there is clearly some limit to what Mahmood will copy from the Danes. But what about those policies she does want to adopt? How have they affected life for refugees in Denmark since the Social Democrats' rightward turn? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Michelle Pace, Professor in Global Studies at Roskilde University in Denmark. She's written extensively on Denmark's immigration policy and has a book on the subject coming out in December.
We'll start with the jewellery law. This was a law that was passed by the parliament here in 2016. The idea was that police can actually take assets of any amount above 1,100 Great British pounds, so that these assets would somehow pay for your stay in Denmark while your application process for asylum was being processed. In effect, it was such a hugely deterrence rhetorical gesture that when we look at the practice of it, it's never been implemented. So just to emphasize the strength of the deterrence policy. Now, when it comes to temporary protection, that's something a little bit more, I think, serious when we come to the effect of it in practice. Anyone granted asylum in Denmark now has 2 years, and after every 2 years, you need to go for an interview with the immigration services, and your file needs to be checked, your situation needs to be checked. And I've interviewed people. I have one example in my mind that I can share with you and your listeners. So a journalist student who fled Damascus because she had prepared a video which was very critical of the Assad regime, comes to Denmark. She starts studying here, journalism again. She learns the language extremely fluently. She has Danish friends in the network. She's now working as a journalist, but every 2 years, she's being called to review her case. And she told me very clearly, if she was to be returned to Damascus, her life would be in danger. Because not only is her life in danger, but so is her family who still lives there. Just because of this video that went viral at the time, and she is considered to be an enemy of the regime. So we're talking about human beings here with agency who have real fear of their life being threatened. And this is what is happening to a majority of these cases. Now, having said that, I've also interviewed people at the Sandholm refugee center, which is where they welcome asylum seekers. And people who receive asylum seekers do also observe that there will always be rotten apples. So you will always have people who make it somehow through the system, but their claim is not actually an authentic one. So I think what we need to discuss is how to structure a safe legal pathway that is organized and that has a very clear pathway to legal asylum for those who are genuinely asylum seekers, whose life is threatened, whose life is persecuted, and who are protected legally by the convention. I think that's important.
I want to get on to the issue of sort of safe routes and whether they need to come with a deterrent in a moment. First of all, though, I suppose just to clarify what the situation is in Denmark. So what's sort of under discussion in this country, although it's still somewhat sort of ambiguous at the time we're speaking, is that at the moment, after 5 years of being a refugee, you can apply for sort of indefinite leave to remain. And there aren't that many conditions. It's sort of almost automatic. And what they're going to shift it to is that if you're on the refugee route, it will take 20 years, which does seem outrageously long. But it can be shorter if you go down a different route for indefinite leave to remain and sort of say, well, I've got a job now, I'm integrated, I've got a family, et cetera, et cetera. Is it the case in Denmark that this lady you're talking about, can she not apply for indefinite leave to remain on a different sort of non-refugee route because now she's got a job and she speaks Danish, etc.? I suppose I want you just to sort of clarify what the situation is. How would she be able to get indefinite leave to remain, or is that just sort of completely impossible for her because she came as a refugee?
Permanent residency is impossible. It's made almost impossible here. So the person I'm talking about, I've been following since she arrived here in 2014, 2015. She has to go to immigration services every 2 years to have her application reviewed. So she cannot apply for permanent residency because now there's a new government in Syria. And now there's again discussion about returning most Syrians back to Syria, even though international human rights organizations stipulate very clearly in their reports that Syria is not yet safe to be returned to.
You mentioned safe routes there, because I suppose one argument for having a sort of deterrent policy is to say, everyone seems to agree we don't want people to illegally come to the country and sort of cross the Mediterranean and take very dangerous routes. So there's going to be a big deterrent for coming illegally, but sort of in tandem with that, we will offer the chance for at least some safe routes from countries of origin. So say if you're sort of organising it with the UN, maybe there'll be sort of some families picked out from a refugee camp. Has that been part of the discussion at all in Denmark, or in Denmark is it very much just zero refugees, we don't want anyone?
Historically, in the last at least years that I've been studying this up and close, because I came to Denmark myself in 2014 after 15 years in the UK, the situation is that Denmark has had a UN quota of 500. It has not even fulfilled these 500 applications that it is obliged to. Then between 2016 and 2020, it froze its UN quota. When it took it up again in 2020, about 200 to 120 asylum applications were granted. So even that quota is not being fulfilled. So I think it's important to think about, why do people, take a boat journey to come to the UK? Do they have a legal pathway? Can they take a ferry and come to the UK? Can they take an air ticket and fly to the UK? They cannot. So I think we need to discuss, how is it possible that someone can either lodge an application while they are abroad, or whether we can create a system that can allow them to lodge that application on arrival in the UK. And if the system is in place, if it's organized, and we can speak, for example, about a good model rather than a negative branded one, the Spanish model, then I think, we can talk about what are the ways in which we can identify who has a genuine case for asylum, who can be granted refugee status, and who is simply a migrant like myself, where I have an EU passport and I can freely travel across the EU member states and work wherever I choose to, because I have an EU passport. So there needs to be also this legal distinction between an asylum seeker, a refugee, and a migrant.
I've got sort of some confusion about what could work, what policy would work. Is that obviously, if you don't want people crossing the Mediterranean, the ideal is you have safe routes in a country of origin, sort of either in Sudan or next to Sudan, just to take one example. But unless you accept on that safe route kind of anyone who might want to come to the UK, because at the moment, or we can say Denmark or wherever, because at the moment, if you're from a dangerous country, you're almost certain to be accepted for good reason. But if you have a safe route, either I think you have to let in enormous amounts of people, or you're going to let in a capped amount of people, and anyone who doesn't fit in that cap is still going to try and come illegally. So, from an electoral perspective, you might have the worst of both worlds. So would safe routes have to come with a deterrent for the people who weren't accepted on the safe route, I suppose is where I'm going with this.
I think the sad thing is that the UK is no longer part of the EU, because what we have been calling for, those of us who research this and lawyers and civil society organizations, is that if we could have a common asylum policy where EU member states share so-called, the weight of the numbers, that's one thing. But the UK is no longer part of this, because in an ideal world, first of all, if we can discuss war governance, how do wars start? I mean, think about Iraq. So our role in that as well. But why do people seek to flee? So the case you mentioned of Sudan is, of course, now extremely important, what's happening to a lot of women and girls, for instance. But ironically, when we had a similar situation, maybe not to that extent, but in Ukraine since February 2022, the European system as a whole was, made available for Ukrainian women and children to come to the EU. And even though they have temporary protection, their ability to renew that is not in the same way as harsh as it is for any other so-called here in Denmark non-Western applicants. So I think we need to somehow have, I'm not a politician, but if our politicians could have a conversation with the people, let's say, in civil society in Sudan, where we create a system where they could lodge an asylum application from where they are, and somehow then have a common asylum policy where we have quotas, which I think would be a reasonable way to go forward, and say, let's see whose life is really in danger according to the convention, because there's an obligation to give protection to people whose life is in danger, and see whether we can create a common asylum policy that can manage this in an organized and safe and legal way. And of course, we need to talk about war governance as well. So what initiates wars? What are the roots of the problem? And how can we ensure that people who, at least the ones that I've been interviewing over the last 10 years, would not necessarily have wanted to leave Syria or Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq, but they had no choice.
And that's come from the Danish Social Democrats, or people who think that this policy has been effective, is that they say that the Danish Social Democrats taking on this policy has sort of really restrained, or I think for a while it collapsed the support of the Danish far right. They were getting 20% in 2015. I think they almost didn't win any seats in Parliament in 2019. Do you think it has been sort of an effective strategy in terms of how do you isolate the far right, who, and I know you might say sort of they've adopted the immigration policies of the far right, but presumably there would be lots of other downsides to the far right getting into power than a more restrictive migration policy. So maybe this is a trade-off that's worth making, someone might argue.
It isn't, and it's a very worrying trend, because the Danish People's Party, which used to be considered for a very long time the far-right party of Denmark, is now on the extreme end of the spectrum. And the Social Democrats have taken their place when it comes to asylum policy. So the discussion now is what's left of social in the Social Democratic Party, and what's left actually of the democratic ideals that the Social Democratic Party used to stand for. So many people who will be voting tomorrow in the municipal elections will have a hard call to find a party that represents truly their values and principles. So the space is left for the Green Party and, a small party towards the center left. And we will see the results, but I do suspect that the Social Democrats will be hit, because a lot of people, especially in major cities, where voters are used to live diversity, who celebrate diversity, they don't see the Social Democrats as representing their values anymore. So they're seeking out to vote for others.
You put forward Spain as an example where they've done things very differently to Denmark, and it's you're more supportive of that system, I suppose. How have they sort of approached this challenge, let's say?
So the Spanish government has been looking at this more as a longue durée policy, so not short-sighted, yes, like the Danish and the UK-based rhetoric, at least. And what they say is that because there is a lower rate of birth, so when they make their calculations, they see that within 20 to 50 years, there's going to be a huge labor shortage in most of the main industries, especially the service industry, because, of course, Spain is a highly touristic attraction. And because they were receiving a lot of applications from Latin American asylum seekers, because of the language, of course, they said we need to turn this into a positive migration model and asylum model. And they started to work very closely with employers' associations, but also civil society organizations, to legalize even those who were unrecognized and already in Spain. So that was the first step. But equally, I think the Spanish government is trying, although it's finding it extremely hard, to actually make the case with facts that their economy has flourished. Their GDP per capita has improved with this kind of system. And when I've spoken to private sector employers here in Denmark, it's a similar case where there are serious labor shortages in the health, in the service industry. And if you look at, for instance, how my international students work, these areas are fulfilled by internationals, by foreign people who come here either on a student visa or on a special work visa. So there are ways and means in which you can legalize and make a pathway to migration a legal one. And there are various possibilities. I just mentioned one, specific work visas for a certain period of time, depending on the shortage in which labor market we're talking about. Having the possibility to discuss, okay, if a family then, would be interested in uniting with a person who's been here on a work visa, what are the possibilities we have for that? And what would be the benefit for our economy? So it's more of a nuanced cost and benefit analysis. So Angela Merkel, if you remember, in 2015 made that calculation, and she had a very clear cost benefit analysis. And she saw the Syrians who were coming then as an asset rather than, as in the case of Denmark, a burden on the welfare state. And today, when you look at the figures, the Syrians in in Germany are contributing to a very high extent to the GDP per capita.
I suppose with Spain, because obviously there's been a backlash in Germany now, hasn't there? And I suppose in terms of the politics here, is Spain in a somewhat unique position because the majority of migrants coming over are from Spanish-speaking countries who will be seen as, culturally similar, and that it would be harder for a country like Denmark to have such a welcoming policy? I mean, I assume there's sort of Danes looking over at Sweden and saying, well, it doesn't seem to have gone very well in Sweden. How would you talk about that, sort of the different situations that different sort of receiving countries might find themselves in?
So I think Spain is also looking into having conversations with countries in Africa, so not just the Latin American continent and region. So their policy is now being extended to other regions and other areas where they have a high number of asylum applications. And I think it's the difference between the deterrence rhetoric and then not being in the limelight, but actually looking into the policy. What is the substance of the policy that we need in order to fulfill labor shortages, in order to have a healthy economy, in order to make sure there's enough accommodation? I mean, we're talking about the real substance of the policy. I think you mentioned Sweden. Sweden used to have a very similar multicultural society that was very vibrant up until some of the politicians in Sweden started to look over the bridge and started to emulate the Danish model. And again, this was a political tactic for the Democrats, the not so social democrat party in Sweden, to again play the Mette Frederiksen card and try and win an election, which they did. So we need to be very careful in the manner in which these political games are being employed, just before or very close to an election. And then when you look at the repercussions, especially if you just take a purely economic perspective, what are we actually talking about? So who would be filling the jobs? I mean, you just had a report in the UK that shows how Brexit has had a huge negative impact on the British economy. So would it be that kind of scenario that Britain is looking at, to have this negative branding, not only nationally, but also in terms of its global, legitimacy and accountability? Is that the kind of image that Britain wants for itself?
That was Michelle Pace, Professor in Global Studies at Roskilde University, speaking to me earlier today. Let's turn to the politics of this and have a look at some of the reactions to Shabana Mahmood's proposals. Plenty of people are pretty upset, including some Labour MPs. The Guardian is reporting that one minister is on resignation watch over the plans. Tony Vaughan is MP for Folkestone, an area heavily affected by small boat crossings. He's opposed. So he said this: the Prime Minister said in September that we are at a fork in the road. These asylum proposals suggest we have taken the wrong turning. The idea that recognised refugees need to be deported is wrong. We absolutely need immigration controls, and where those controls decide to grant asylum, we should welcome and integrate, not create perpetual limbo and alienation. The rhetoric around these reforms encourages the same cultures of divisiveness that sees racism and abuse growing in our communities. The government is wrong to think that reviews of safety in the person's country every few years will mean refugees can be returned at scale. That hasn't happened in Denmark. Brutal dictators tend to hang on to power. It would just move huge amounts of resources away from making our asylum system work as it should by cutting initial decision delays and the appeals backlog, sorting out asylum accommodation, making the UK-France deal work, removing those whose claims fail. So they're the policies he thinks would work. The government must think again on this. Fellow Labour MP Stella Creasy has written an article in The Guardian. In it, she says that all Mahmood's reforms will achieve is ICE-style raids on Britain's streets, and calls on the government to get serious about the factors that create refugees rather than demonising them. 13 Labour MPs have now come out against the proposals. But Mahmood's policies are proving popular with some. This was the response from Reform UK's leader, Nigel Farage. He said, the Home Secretary sounds like a reform supporter. It's a shame that the Human Rights Act, ECHR, and her own backbenchers mean that this will never happen. And Tommy Robinson appeared to approve too. So reacting to the news that those granted refugee status might still be deported later, Robinson said this: the Overton window has now been obliterated. Well done, patriots. Helena, thank you for your patience. What's your perspective on this set of announcements from Shabana Mahmood?
Very surprised to hear that I'm not particularly pleased with these kind of things. They all seem performatively cruel in some cases, reasonably unworkable in other cases, and difficult to administer and costly to administer in other cases. So I don't really have a particularly strong view that these are good. I think they're pretty bad in lots of cases, but it's clear that there is public consent for them. I mean, lots of this is due to a bunch of misinformation and lies that have come from the media in describing the reality of what asylum seekers are going through. I think a lot of the public consent for this comes from this mythical idea that they're being given the life of Riley in 4-star hotels rather than crammed 5 people into a room and cooking meals on the floor of their showers, which is what happened when the BBC went into an asylum hotel and actually spoke to the people that were living there. It's a poorly administered system. It does need an overhaul. I've been saying this for a while. The issue, of course, is that the kind of reforms I would want to see involve some level of trust in the state that they're going to do these things and they're not going to be abused by the current or later governments. For example, I'd like to see some kind of specific built processing center like they have in European countries, except how would we know these aren't going to turn into another Jarl's Wood, for example? You can't trust the government to run these in a humane manner, so that's a very difficult situation. Offshore processing is something that we could do as well if we wanted to have safe routes for people to get here and have processing done without people coming to the community straight away. But then you might end up where the government would abuse this into the situation you see in Nauru or in Papua New Guinea during the asylum system in Australia. And what's frustrating is that these lies about the life of Riley these asylum seekers are going through have permeated so far that even Shabana Mahmood, who knows that that's not true, she knows that the life of an asylum seeker is not a good one, hence why she was calling for an amnesty when she was a backbencher, how some people's opinions change when they have no principles in the first place. And so she knows that they're not in good conditions, and yet can continue talking about the UK being a golden ticket for asylum seekers, which is what she said when speaking to Laura Kuenssberg at the weekend, despite the fact that Laura Kuenssberg pointed out that they get less here than in other European countries, ones which have higher asylum uptake than we do. And when you look at the actual reasons for people coming here, it's mostly the linguistic connection, a colonial connection or a familial connection are the reasons why they choose it. I mean, GB News literally sent one of their own interviewers over to speak to migrants in Calais who said, no, the only reason I'm coming to the UK is because I speak the language. I don't speak these other languages. It's not the level of deterrence, right? The pull factors, as Shabana Mahmood said in her interview with Sky News there, because I don't know about you, but I don't think most asylum seekers check in up to date on The Guardian or on the Daily Mail or whatever it is to look at just how draconian our system is before choosing. They think, which language do I speak? Where do I have connections? And they choose there and they pay a people smuggler. I don't think those people smugglers who really want to take the money off them are going to give them the full picture of what the lack of rosiness is across the channel when they get here, should Shabana Mahmood's reforms go through. The political concerns are interesting to me, though, insofar as what we expected during the run-up to the election and afterwards, when the McSweeney Politburo at the top of the party had this real vice grip on control of candidate selections to ensure that they had maximum fealty to the Starmer administration, maximum loyalty, clearly hasn't gone far enough to be able to push through any policy, because we saw a significant backbench rebellion over the PIP cuts, for example, because even when you try and really kind of pinpoint where your MP selections are, you still really, if you're looking within the ranks of Labour MPs, can't find people who want to take money away from the disabled. And this was true. Like they had to climb down on the majority of their plans to change the PIP requirements because backbench Labour MPs, at the very least, have enough moral fibre to not think that these things are a good thing. And in the run-up to the vote that they had on this specific policy that backbench MPs didn't support, did Keir Starmer spend any time trying to win over these backbench MPs? No, not for the 9 months between announcing the policy and actually trying to pass it through the policy, which was a real problem for them. So what we'll end up with is a similar situation here, where the Politburo will expect that they'll be able to put through this policy with no pushback from their own backbenchers, not actually go through the rigmarole of winning them over on this policy, and then it'll come to vote in the Commons and they'll get humiliated again. So it'll be interesting to see how many of these MPs are happy to be on board with something like taking away valuables from people fleeing persecution. But even the most hardline of Labour MPs, it seems, would probably think that this was going a bit far. The issue, of course, is do they think that their seat is vulnerable to a reform surge at the next election, which lots of them do too. So there's a real kind of push-pull thing. Whereas the kind of reform voters who wouldn't vote for them if they didn't do this asylum policy are also ones who actually think that taking money away from the disabled is bad. So there's a different factor there other than just their own moral principles too.
Yeah, well, I suppose I think lots of this is just performatively cruel. I think the jewelry stuff, maybe she's introduced the jewelry stuff so that the backbench MPs can get some kind of win when it's taken out of the law. That's it. Maybe she's playing some kind of chess there. I think that would, it's going to upset too many people, even if it does come out of the law in the end. But I suppose where I stand on this, beyond the specifics here, and where I suppose I differ from some people on the left, is that I do think you need a deterrent factor, because I find the current refugee regime difficult to defend. Right? We basically have a system where no one in the West thinks we're going to be able to accept all the people who might want to come here, who might have some claim to refuge. So to make less people arrive, what we do is we make it as difficult as possible to get here. So the Europeans, they pay the Libyans loads of money to try and round up refugees before they cross the Mediterranean Sea. They also pay Tunisia to do a similar thing. They pay Turkey to do a similar thing. And what that means is that it's incredibly dangerous, more dangerous than it would otherwise be to get here. And we've got all of this messaging from our government and from the European government saying, do not come here, do not come here, do not come here. We're going to spend loads of money to make it as difficult as possible to come here. But if you do manage to get through after risking your life in multiple ways, then, if you're from a dangerous country, you probably can have asylum. And then probably in short order, you will be able to get all the rights of a citizen. And that to me seems like a strange policy. You're sort of saying, please, please don't come. We're going to make it as deadly as possible to come. But then if you manage to sort of succeed through that trial of ordeal, you will get the rights of citizenship quite soon, which, obviously loads of people are still going to do that. And I would much prefer an asylum system where there was no incentive to come irregularly, to try and cross the Mediterranean, but we as a government did, a significant number of resettlement from safe routes. So also you're not just filtering out the people who feel like they're willing to take risk, which is mainly going to be young men. And you can actually pick out, whole families. You can pick out women and children. You can pick out the people who are the most needy from UN refugee camps. And I suppose going to the Australia example, because obviously, the way those refugees were dealt with on Nauru and stuff was revolting. But the outcome seems to be, so I was looking up this today, Australia does resettle more people than pretty much any other country in the world. And that's because, is it because they could have done both? But I think that's in part because they've got permission to do it because no one comes by boat anymore. So if you can get to a system where there's no incentive to come irregularly, but you have a chance of getting there on legal routes, to me, that would actually be a better outcome. And you would need a deterrence, because unless you're going to give anyone who wants asylum, which is going to be tens of millions of people, you are going to have to reject some people. And unless you have a deterrent, then those people you're rejecting are going to just come irregularly. Do you see where I'm coming from?
I do see where you're coming from. And obviously Australia is an interesting example, but given that the journey is quite different to those who we're trying to stop, who are just crossing the channel rather than, getting in boats across the Pacific, it's a different kind of dynamic. But when I was looking into the stats that Migration Observatory were looking at in terms of how our asylum acceptance or the number of people coming here to seek asylum has changed as we've changed our laws to make them more draconian, and likewise in other countries in Europe, the ways in which that we've ramped up being anti-asylum or making it less of a golden ticket, quote unquote, these kind of removal of pull factors hasn't kind of materially changed the number of people coming and seeking asylum. I don't think that many of these people are going to be keeping up to date with the reality of what claiming asylum in the UK is like before coming here. I don't think that there's going to be that much cut through, at least not in the short term, which is broadly, I think, what we're looking at in terms of the kind of asylum flights that we're seeing at the moment. We've got a real kind of confluence of loads of different conflicts happening at the same time that has caused such a recent rush of people arriving here via irregular means over that course of period. As I said, having some kind of offshore processing would probably be the easiest way of being able to do that, insofar as you do have people resettling here, you do get them through a safe route, you do make sure that people have asylum claims heard who need them to be heard. because then you're not just filtering out people by who can pay a people smuggler, you're filtering people out by, okay, we'll hear your claim, just you can only come to the UK once we know that your asylum claim is legitimate and you're not, quote unquote, an economic migrant. The reality, of course, though, is that most of them are legitimate asylum seekers. And whilst you say, the most needy ones are women and children, I mean, men are also very needy too, and their asylum claims aren't necessarily that lower in acceptance than women and children, and they are ones making the journey because they are the ones who are able to do so. I mean, there was a really great clip I saw from the TV show Go Back to Where You Came From, where they took people who were skeptical of asylum seekers and got them to speak to people who were trying to get here by small boat, and they interacted with these people. They were going, yeah, I am coming here as a man because I am the one who's able to do so. And should I be able to get there and get my asylum claim upheld because I'm fleeing Syria, for example, then my family will come over as well. I think that's the majority of cases. But as you say, there has to be a way of ensuring that you filter out those who are legitimate and try and stop people arriving via irregular means, because it's dangerous and there's no public consent for it. Again, as I've said before, I think the difficulty is ensuring you have a government that can have a system that can manage that in a humane way, and also making sure you have safeguards in place that a future government can't turn it into what we're seeing over on the islands surrounding Australia. Because, I mean, as you say, the cases were horrific. People were sewing their mouths shut in protest to the inhumane treatment in the asylum detention centres on the islands surrounding Australia, which was Nauru and it was Papua New Guinea, the main two centres there. And those were both exploited as government contracts by friends of the Liberal Party in Australia. So that's another problem, is that how do you ensure that there's going to be enough transparency with this stuff? It's a difficult situation, granted. I'm not saying I have all the solutions, but being performatively cruel and draconian clearly cannot be the response.
Practically, there's an issue here, because I know what you're saying about you don't think people sort of are checking the rules and stuff, but I do think word gets around. If someone's traveled to that country and it was good, they're going to tell their friends. Like, I think a big story about sort of why so many more people are moving than they used to is because of smartphones. So people are much better informed. The reason I don't think copying Denmark will necessarily work, though, is because I think when people are going to Denmark, there is a bit of sort of picking and choosing. You're going to Northern Europe, you're thinking, you probably don't speak Danish, Swedish, German, or Norwegian, or Dutch, right? So you probably don't know anyone there at that point in time. So you are kind of looking, what is going to be the place where I can most effectively build a life? And if Denmark have explicitly made it very difficult, then people will say, oh, okay, instead of going to Denmark, I'll go to Sweden, or I'll go to Germany, or I'll go to Holland. With Britain, I think it is a different story, because people come to the UK because it's a big country, big economy, English language, sort of colonial legacy, likely or more likely to know people. So the idea that you can say, what Shabana Mahmood seems to be doing is saying, look, we're not actually that good. Why don't you try going to France instead? Why don't you try going to this country instead? I think that sort of misunderstands the difference between the UK and Denmark. So the risk for Mahmood here is it makes her look mean, but doesn't have that much effect. Because I think the stupidest thing that Labour could do is try and win over Reform voters with tough rhetoric. The only way they're going to win over Reform voters on this issue is if they actually stop the boats. So, you need to stop having policies that there's only the slimmest chance of them succeeding. Do you want a final point on this before we go to our final story, Helena?
I think the policy that I really want to see implemented, because one of the biggest things that's causing tension is the use of hotels, and also the use of dispersal accommodation, whether it's hotels or whether it's private accommodation, because it's seen as getting something for free. It's seen as being taking the taxpayer for a ride. When you actually speak to people, when you get down to the median voter, most people say, I support looking after people, I support people coming here by legitimate means, I just don't support them getting free stuff that I have to work for. That's the central argument, I think, that you most hear from the median voter, rather than the reform headbangers or what people would describe as the open borders lefties on the other side. Not that we actually believe in open borders, but regardless, that's the kind of median position. I really want to see the hotel use stopped. And as I said before, I think the best way of doing this is having purpose-built processing centres, so that we know that people are in a place where they're not part of the general population. People are worried about that, about people being unvetted. You can use these places, you can invest in them, so you can have English training centres so people get better at speaking the language. You can make sure that they are getting the kind of stuff that they need to be properly integrated into society, which is another concern people have. And it means that you can take them out of the sight of people in the public who are thinking 4-star hotel, getting it for free, even if that's not the case. I would really like to see a proper purpose-built asylum processing centres, and I would like to see them not turn into Jarl's Wood. I want to see proper investment in ensuring the people that we do accept here, which we should be accepting because, despite all of these talks from Edward Lee of Shabana Mahmood coming a conservative, it's not a conservative position to look at the Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights that we signed up to under Winston Churchill being undermined or in some cases torn up for cheap political ends because we think that it's going to be getting the consent of the public with which to do so. That's very unconservative as far as I am concerned. So we need to ensure finding a way that we can get public buy-in for this. And I think tackling that central feeling of unfairness is what's important. Again, you just have to make sure that you're doing it in such a way that it doesn't become degrading or inhumane treatment, which is the worry that I have. So if there's one solution I really, really want to see is purpose-built asylum accommodation, because that I think would satisfy lots of people, would be able to put investment into making sure these people are more economically beneficial for the country when they do come here, ready to join the workforce, ready to become integrated into society, getting lessons like they do in Norway. Norway has a really comprehensive program of teaching refugees Norwegian, making them learn about Norwegian culture and heritage and all of the kind of local customs of the area to ensure that they can blend seamlessly back into society when they get here. That's what I really, really wanted to see, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana's new party has been dogged by public spats and a level of mismanagement that would take too long to recount here. But essentially, it's split into two factions. On the one side, you have Zara Sultana. On the other, you have Jeremy Corbyn and the Independent Alliance as a group of 4 independent MPs elected last year. All that changed on Friday, though. That's when Blackburn MP Adnan Hussain dramatically quit your party just hours after Novara Media sent him a polite email asking him to comment on allegations that he didn't even want to become a member of the group. In his resignation letter, Hussain said this: the culture surrounding the party has become dominated by persistent infighting, factional competition, and a struggle for power, position, and influence rather than a shared commitment to the common good. I have also been deeply troubled by the way certain figures within the steering process, particularly Muslim men, have been spoken about and treated. At times, the rhetoric has been disturbingly similar to the very political forces the left claims to oppose. Hussain had been at a centre of a number of political storms. Many amongst your party's base were unhappy about his involvement in a number of real estate and rental companies while steering the formation of a socialist party. But it was a split between Zara Sultana and Adnan Hussain over trans rights that seemed to cause the biggest outrage among the membership. Late last summer, Hussain called for, quote, safe third spaces for trans women, asserting that women's rights and safe spaces should not be encroached upon. He also added that trans women are, quote, not biologically women and hence trans women as 2 separate words. That appeared to earn a public rebuke from Sultana, who posted this a few days later. Trans rights are human rights. Your party will defend them, no ifs, no buts, and I won't let anyone, whoever they are, get in the way of this fight. Solidarity always. Of course, it's not as though your party didn't have enough problems beyond ideological splits. There's been a standoff over £800,000 of your party funds, which are now slowly being transferred from Zara Sultana to the steering committee. There's also been a continuing row over member data. And as recently as last week, Sultana claimed she'd been sabotaged just moments before a question time appearance when the Corbyn faction put out a statement that she said undermined her. Helena, we've spoken before about sort of the troubles of your party, and you're a Green Party member, so obviously you've got sort of specific views on this. So I suppose it'd actually probably be more interesting to discuss the sort of general principle here, which was a debate about what are the limits of who can be in a left-wing party. So should social conservatives be allowed in a left-wing party? If social conservatives are excluded, would that impact religious people who might want to be a member of the party and therefore be exclusionary in its own way or be a barrier to building proper coalitions? I wondered what you sort of thought about this debate that's been brewing online, I suppose for months now, but especially this weekend.
I probably should start off with an apology. So in response to Adnan Hussein's statement, I tweeted out something that was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it was minimising potential Islamophobia that he had faced. And I want to apologise to Adnan for that. I do say sorry for that. And I Although, to be fair, what I will say, he is still a landlord and I still have that issue. But what I will say about the broader debate around social progressivism versus social conservatism, but united by kind of left-wing economics. Now, there will need to be a broad coalition of people if we want to implement left-wing economics in this country. Plenty of social conservatives support our positions on nationalization, on workers' rights, on industrial policy, on international geopolitics. That will always be the case, right? The issue, of course, is trying to find a way of making sure the economic issues are what are the most salient without undermining our own principles as part of that party, right? So when it comes to issues such as trans rights, for example, it does seem to be the opposition really rate this issue much higher than they care themselves about class issues. It does seem to me that there are plenty of people who are willing to say, well, if you won't support my position that is trans exclusionary, I won't vote for your progressive party despite that shared interest in economics. Whereas I don't think any person who supports social policy would vote for the Conservatives, for example, for their right-wing economic policy if they started being socially progressive. I think that's a different kind of dynamic, which makes it harder to unify social conservatives into a left-wing party on economics. But what I will say, when it comes to the Adnan Hussein situation very specifically, is that I don't think there's anything wrong with having your own personal beliefs that are socially conservative if you're part of a broader left-wing party. Like, no one really cares what Adnan Hussein does or doesn't think of in his own time, likewise with any other social conservative. The issue is when it comes to being advocating for that policy as broader party policy. And the second, it comes to when you're put onto the steering committee of this party, when that view clearly is different from what I've seen in terms of social media interactions with the median position of the party that you're there to represent. Like, if his open position was, I have this own personal view, but I would take a backseat. All of these policies have to be decided by the membership, and whatever they say will go, and I'll keep that otherwise to myself. I don't think many people would have an issue. The fact that he keeps, I guess I don't want to make it specifically about him, but the fact that people who disagree with a pro-trans position seem to want to continue making it part of their public advocacy. Well, I mean, you're part of a broadly progressive party. I don't think that they're going to really take much light to that. And if you get backlash, then I don't see why you're surprised. I saw another tweet which was talking about the idea that people of religious minority backgrounds feel like that their religious beliefs should be left at the door. And I'm like, well, the left have always kind of been secular, at least for the past kind of 30, 40 years in this country. Like, most religious minorities are expected to leave their beliefs at the door and argue for their positions from a materialistic or a naturalistic standpoint as secular ideology would dictate. Look what happened to Tim Farron when he was the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Now, obviously, they're a right-wing party on the economy, so it's not an exact comparison, but it was clear that his views on homosexuality were totally out of step with the Liberal Democrat supporter base. And so people wanted to make sure that those beliefs of his didn't actually impact on the Liberal Democrats' policy as a leader of the party, not as obviously, it's a leadership position that's the issue here. All parties are broad coalitions. All parties will have people who disagree on certain issues, whether they're economic or social or whatever. But it's got to be a group decision. The reason why I'm very happy being a member of the Green Party is we've almost universally dictated in terms of how our members have voted on policy to be pro-trans, and people who want to be a part of that can be a part of that if they really want. But if they want to put their interests in support of gender critical viewpoints above our inclusive policy on the economy, our internationalist geopolitics, or redistribution as part of our economic policy, or whatever it might be, well, that's up to them. That's up to them. But if you have a left-wing politics that's built on popular consent, that's built upon a democratic mandate from members rather from the top down, then anybody who joins that from the outside can make the choice to do so or not, and that's up to them. The difference comes when that is trying to be imposed from the top down, or indeed when someone is making those views clear despite the fact that it is totally out of step with the membership on this issue. I mean, look at the backlash that Adrian Ramsey got for not even going half as far as Adnan Hussein did on trans people and the issues of gender identity within policy. There was quite a lot of backlash, and I'm not going to say that entirely contributed to Adrian Ramsey and Ailey Chowns losing the leadership election, but it was clear what side of this debate the broader Green Party membership led. And I don't think that we're going to see that happen. I think we will see a similar kind of thing happen when it comes to the member base of your party as well.
That was a big issue with your party. I mean, obviously, it still exists, even if the launch hasn't gone so well. Is that because you had a very specific moment in 2024 where you had a group of MPs against all odds, very impressively, winning their seats as independents, which is incredibly rare in British politics, on, mainly a single issue, a very important issue, but on Gaza. And now they've tried to form a political party. And actually that single issue is not enough to base a political party on. It feels a bit to me like your party is, if you try and make a Gaza protest into a political party, and there are alliances that make sense for a single issue that don't necessarily translate into being a political party with a broad platform and program. So while I tend to be very broad church when it comes to political parties, there does seem to be something incoherent about your party because of the outsized role that these independent MPs have had in shaping it, when actually, they were elected on pretty much a single issue, which doesn't necessarily mean they have much more in common with the general vision for your party of its membership. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when you look at the voting records, when they're starting to vote against, and all the Independent Alliance members, apart from Jeremy Corbyn, voted against putting VAT on private schools, and I'm just like, well, it's not very socialist, is it? And this was what it was billed as. It was billed as a mass movement socialist party from the start, from Zara and Jeremy. I don't know who it was who invited the Independent Alliance members in to help start your party. And that was, to be fair, that was Iqbal Mohammed's point. He was like, well, we were just asked to come in here and start this up. Like, you don't go accusing us of trying to upset the apple cart. We were invited in and we're making our views heard as independent MPs. But as far as I can see, they're just kind of liberal Democrats who are pro-Gaza, right? I mean, Ayub Khan was literally a liberal Democrat up until 2024, until he, left for pretty, for perfectly acceptable reasons, that he was standing on principle over Gaza, over criticism of Israel, and he left the party. And I think it was probably good that he did. And Adnan Hussain, Iqbal Mohammed, Shaka Adam, and Ayub Khan are serving their communities as independents. I mean, I think the best part of this really is that Adnan Hussain is very clear that he's there to represent the members that voted him in, the people of Blackburn that voted him in. And that's always going to cause tension as an independent MP with the broader interests of a political party that up until very recently he was part of candidate selection for, at least in the registration for your party as a political party. And him no longer being a part of that means he can focus more on being the independent MP for those people that elected him, for that community that he says that he represents. There's probably a better outcome for both him and your party for them to be going their separate ways. But Shocker Adam himself did an interview with the New Statesman. So, well, I'm pro-business. I'm a small business owner. I own an opticians. Multiple of these people are landlords. It's not just one or two of them. Multiple of the Independent Alliance MPs are landlords as well. And that is quite literally being the bourgeois. That you are a rentier capitalist if you're a landlord. That's not compatible with socialism, friend. That's not how that works. And it's clear, as you say, that just having a singular point that you agree on, internationalist foreign policy, a foreign policy which is anti-American unipolarity, anti-support for Israel's colonial project in the Middle East, is not big enough of an issue to be able to create a political alliance on. And when you start inviting in landlords into Progressive Economic Party, when you start inviting in people who can't even bring themselves to want to tax the high earners, who are the vast majority of people who send their kids to private schools, it's clear that there is not much in terms of economic policy that's going to unite these going forward. That's always been the issue.
Yeah, and I mean, if you don't have an economic policy to unite you, then the social issues probably really will tear you apart. We will wrap up there. If you want to read more about the resignation of Adnan Hussain, you can check out our story by Harriet Williamson, who dove into the circumstances surrounding the resignation. That's up at novaramedia.com now. You can find a link in the description below. Thank you so much, Helena, for joining me tonight.
An absolute pleasure, Michael. Looking forward to Thursday where I'll be hosting. Just to trail myself there.
You're very welcome to trail yourself at any moment. Please keep trailing yourself, especially if it's on our channel. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.